Some children inherit their parents' passion. Tom Ballard was shaped by it. His childhood was filled with rock faces, climbing ropes, and expedition tents. His mom, Alison Hargreaves, was one of the greatest mountaineers of all time. But when Tom was just 6 years old, everything changed. Alison vanished in a storm near the summit of K2, one of the deadliest peaks on Earth. Most kids run from the thing that took their mother, but Tom, he ran straight toward it. As he grew into one of the most talented climbers of his generation, Tom set his sights on the world's toughest peaks. Eventually, his path led him back to the same mountain range where his mother was lost, to Nanga Parbat in winter, just miles from K2. And in the end, his journey would take him closer to his mother's fate than he ever could have imagined. This is a story of Tom Ballard. Tom Ballard was practically born in a sleeping bag. His mother, Alison Hargreaves, was already making history in the climbing world when he came along in 1988. She became famous for soloing the 6 great North Faces in the Alps in a single summer, and later for being the first British woman to climb Everest without supplemental oxygen. For some kids, the mountains are just something you see in pictures or maybe on a vacation, but for Tom, they were home. He spent his earliest years at the base of climbing routes, bundled up in a tent while his mother took on these towering rock faces. His father, Jim Ballard, was also a climber, though less well known than Alison. Their family life revolved around the outdoors. While other kids shuffled between soccer practice and piano lessons, Tom and his younger sister Kate moved between climbing destinations. By the time Tom could walk, he was hiking beside Alison, scrambling over rocks, learning to tie knots, balancing on ledges, and navigating steep terrain. When Alison climbed Mount Everest in 1995, Tom and Kate were there too, waiting for her at base camp. At 6 years old, Tom didn't fully grasp what an achievement it was for his mother to reach the top of the world's highest peak without oxygen. To him, it was just another adventure that they were on. He had no way of knowing that just a few months later that his world would be turned upside down. After her triumphant Everest climb, Alison came home and spent a few quiet days with the kids before leaving to K2. They went to the beach and they collected shells and they climbed the small hills nearby. Then, as she left for K2, Jim dropped her off at the airport. And there was no dramatic goodbye, just a quick parting like any other trip. But as Alison turned away, her eyes welled up with tears. They were both climbers, they knew the risks, but they never really talked about them. Jim said, "I never dwell on thoughts of death. If you climb, you accept the risks. A climbing death is not a tragedy." Jim was at home in Scotland when the phone rang. The voice on the other end asked if he heard the news, and his heart dropped. There was a storm on K2 and Alison didn't make it down. For a moment, he just refused to believe it. She was supposed to be on her way home. In fact, in her last letter, she had said that she was starting her descent and would be on the plane later that day. So why was she on the summit? And then came the explanation. Al Hinks, Alison's original climbing partner, filled in the missing pieces. She had split from him to join an American team, and when Al summited and Alison didn't, she decided to stay and give it one more go. Al later said that she talked non-stop about the kids at base camp, but he also sensed something else, an obsession with reaching the top. And then came the final update. The storm had hit the mountain with 100-mile-per-hour winds, and no one who had been on the summit was coming back. That night, before she knew what happened to her mother, 4-year-old Kate wandered into Jim's room asking for a hug. And the next morning, he sat the kids down and told them that their mom was caught in a storm and he didn't think they were coming home. Kate burst into tears and hugged him, but Tom, who was just 6 years old at the time, just sat still. Soon his eyes teared up and he simply asked his dad, "Can we go see Mom's last mountain?" Jim didn't hesitate and said yes. Yes, we can and we will. Just 4 weeks later, in mid-September, Jim and the kids boarded a train in London, beginning their long journey to K2. Now, not everyone supported the trip. There are veteran mountaineers out there who questioned the decision to take such young children on a long, grueling, high-altitude trek. Alison's parents were the most vocal, insisting that the kids should be older to make that trip. But Jim said he was determined to keep his promise to Tom. Even now, it's a decision that raises questions. Was it right to take a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old through some of the world's toughest terrain? The journey would involve dangerous roads, high altitudes, extreme weather, and physical challenges that pushed even seasoned climbers to their limits. And even Alison had commented that the trek to K2 was far harder than the trek to Everest. Jim reminded people that the kids had spent 3 months in the Himalayas in 1995 during Alison's first Everest attempt. They had already lived at high altitude, but there was one problem with that argument. Kate had gotten so sick that they had to rush her down to lower elevations. She recovered and they were able to stay at base camp, but it was a bit of a warning sign. Some people wondered if this was really about closure or something else. Jim held press conferences about the trip, and newspapers offered to cover the costs. When asked if he was profiting off of Alison's death, Jim insisted that his only concern was taking care of Tom and Kate. And then there was the BBC film crew. Their cameras followed the family's every move, turning what Jim said was a private journey of closure into something much more public. This journey had already begun to divide opinions, and they hadn't even reached the mountains yet. They flew into Islamabad, Pakistan, and Jim received surprising news. Some of Alison's belongings had been left behind. He thought he had everything of hers, but there was more that was still out there, so he decided to collect things on the way back. They had one more flight to Skardu, where they would then continue their journey by vehicle. Jim looked out the window of the plane and saw Nanga Parbat, a massive peak at 8,125 meters or 26,600 feet, the 9th highest mountain in the world. He didn't know it at the time, but 24 years later, this peak would be linked forever to Tom's name. Stories like this one stay with you. The weight of the loss, the lingering questions, and the impossible grief. Kate, Jim, and even Tom, they all carried it in different ways. And this story hit me harder than I expected. I even posted about it on my community tab, and so many of you commented and said that you understood. And I think it stuck with me because grief isn't just something that happens, it's something that you carry. It doesn't follow a timeline, it doesn't have a set schedule. It sneaks up on you in moments that you don't expect. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about it with someone you trust. That's why I'm excited to say today's paid partner is BetterHelp. Having someone to talk to can make all the difference when you're navigating life's transitions or you're just trying to understand your own motivations. BetterHelp makes therapy available online, so whether you're processing complex emotions or you're working through some big decisions in life, you can easily find the support you need. BetterHelp is a platform where therapists and their clients can communicate effectively and get the most out of therapy. Just fill out a questionnaire and you'll match with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. And if you don't feel like the first therapist is the right fit, you can easily switch to another one until you find someone you really connect with. So if you're going through a tough time right now or you just feel like you could use a little extra support, let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/adventuresgonewrong. The link is in the description below. Or you can choose Adventures Gone Wrong during sign-up. Enjoy a special discount on your first month. The flight crew invited them into the cockpit, and soon K2 came into view, this massive, unmistakable pyramid that rose above all the other mountains. Kate stared at it quietly and said nothing. Tom pressed close against Jim, and he was quiet. Months earlier, Alison had seen that first glimpse of K2 from the same plane. It was another parallel in a journey full of them. After 3 days in Skardu, acclimatizing at the infamous K2 motel, the same place Alison had stayed, they set off for the long drive towards Ascoli, the last village before their trek started. The roads were rough and they had to be constantly rebuilt due to landslides and fluctuating river levels, and some sections of the road barely existed. In her own journal, Alison had written about this part of the journey. She said, "On Friday, June 16th, it was dusty but great fun this morning. We had a tea and biscuit stop at a village that consisted of a couple of houses. What a strange, rough, yet easy world. We bounced up and down in the dust for 7 hours." Jim, on the other hand, found it terrifying. He described how the vehicles had to hug the wall so they didn't fall off the cliff, and the wheels were just gripping the banks, and people were starting to go pale. It was so scary. But Tom, he was oblivious to the danger and he loved every second of it. In Ascoli, they met Ibrahim, a 6'6" high-altitude porter and father of 6. He was assigned to be Kate's personal minder, carrying her on his back throughout the mountains. And Kate adored him immediately, and they didn't even speak the same language, but they chatted away to each other for hours and hours, somehow kind of understanding each other. Meanwhile, Tom was already showing signs of who he would become. Even on the trail, schoolwork was mandatory for him. At one point, local kids peeked at him from behind the bushes, curious about this foreign boy studying in the middle of nowhere. Tom ignored them and just focused on his work. And he hated the cameras. The constant filming annoyed him, and that's something that would stay with him throughout his life. People would later accuse him of having an ego as a climber, but those who knew him best said it was the opposite. He disliked the attention. Jim saw a lot of Alison in Tom. She had never cared much for cities or crowds. She was at her most comfortable when she was in the mountains, away from everything. And Tom was the same. He belonged out here. As they pushed higher in the mountains, the journey took a turn. Tom got sick one night and he was vomiting everywhere. Jim immediately woke up the expedition doctor, who suspected it was probably just something that Tom ate, but what if it wasn't? If Tom wasn't okay by morning, they'd have to turn back. Lying awake that night, Jim couldn't shake the doubt that kept creeping in. Had he been too stubborn bringing the kids here? Was he risking too much? He thought back to Alison's Everest expedition, and there was a terrifying moment at base camp when a violent windstorm hit them in the middle of the night. Jim grabbed the kids and huddled with them in the dark, bracing for an avalanche that he thought was coming, but it never did. When it was over, it was just a windstorm, but it had knocked down the research tents and blew them down the glacier. Was he making the same mistake now? But by morning, Tom got restless and was ready to go. They decided to continue, keeping the day's trek pretty short to make sure that they didn't overdo it. The next day, Tom was completely fine, and Jim was pretty relieved. As they rounded a bend later that day, Jim stopped in his tracks suddenly. Through a thin gap in the clouds, that familiar triangle of white and gray appeared. It was K2. Jim quickly called Tom and Kate over, and for the first time, they saw their mother's last mountain. They all stood there just staring in silence. Then just as quickly, the clouds rolled back in and K2 was gone. Jim said someone somewhere wanted us to see it. Tom didn't say a word. He just stood there staring into the clouds. Jim later reflected on that moment and he said this was an important moment for all of us. This was the landscape that Alison belonged to, and now it belonged to Alison. For the first time since we set off, I could sense your spirit, wild and free. It almost felt as if they'd been here before, though they never had. It wasn't until Jim read Alison's diaries that he realized that she had crossed in this exact spot months before. This was where the kids would say their final goodbyes. Tom and Kate built little cairns, stacking stones as a tribute to their mother. Tom pulled out a drawing of K2 that he had made and he tucked it beneath the stones. And there were no tears, no dramatic gestures, just silence and reflection. Jim later said, "That day closed my life with Alison. I brought the children here so she could have one last look at them. And for the children, this was the last page in their chapter with their mother." On the way back, Jim picked up some of Alison's belongings. Her sleeping bag and much of her gear were still at the high camp on K2 and weren't able to be recovered. But at base camp, they found her cameras, rolls of film, and a few personal items. One camera was likely around her neck when she died. When Jim later developed the film, he found rare glimpses of Alison behind the scenes. She was sunbathing at base camp, laughing, eating meat for the first time since Everest because she was a vegetarian until then, and talking into the camera just days before her final climb. Jim had never truly believed Alison would die in the mountains, and yet here they were. He said, "I never broke down in public. That's just not my way. The only people I shared my emotions with were Tom and Kate." And with that, they left K2 behind, and it was time to start over. After K2, life got pretty tough for the family. Jim packed up everything and they moved the family to the Italian Dolomites. The mountains there weren't as high as the Himalayas, but they were just as wild and dramatic and endless. And it was not only familiar terrain for the family, it was more than that. It was a place that they could start over. The relationship between Jim and Tom was complex. Their bond wasn't built on words or affection. It was quiet, possibly shaped by grief, resilience, and the mountain life. Jim once admitted that when Tom was born, I loved him intensely right away, but I found it difficult to have a great deal of interest in him when he first came home. While Alison had been a full-time mother at the time, Jim was often working. And it wasn't until Kate came along that he realized that he barely knew his own son. and that realization made him want to spend more time with the family. The Dolomites soon became Tom's playground. While other kids were out riding bikes or playing video games, Tom was out on the cliffs, figuring out how to move on the rock the way other kids learned to ride a bike. He was quiet but determined, and the mountains were pulling him in. Tom was 11 when he had a realization at school that all he wanted to do was climb. His first climb had been at 5 years old on a small route in the Mediterranean. Alison thought he was too young and said no when he asked if he could climb. But when she wandered away, Tom asked Jim, and he let him. Tom was excited, but Alison wasn't thrilled when she came back. Even at that age, though, Tom was a natural. And he was more than just a climber, he was a voracious reader. He loved learning things, but he hated school. By 14, he barely attended, choosing to go skiing and climbing whenever the weather allowed. And that's when he discovered bouldering. He found that bouldering was raw. You didn't have to use ropes, there was no safety net, it was just you and the rocks, and he was hooked. He would grab his crash pad and disappear into the mountains and climb for hours and hours alone. And that was the beginning of his solo career. Over the next 5 years, Tom completed over 1,000 new boulder routes in Scotland, alone. And he even wrote his own bouldering guidebook to Glen Nevis. Kate said he was always off exploring. He was quiet and serious, but had a childlike humor. She said he could be fun, but underneath it all, there was always something serious about him. A climbing partner of his, Marcin Tomaszewski, described him as being very quiet. He said he didn't speak much, but he did a lot. He had a lot of energy. He was like a volcano before an eruption. He was patient and at the same time very active. It was hard to know more about him. I felt a sadness in him. Marco Berti, an Italian alpinist who had known both Tom and Alison, saw it too. He believed Tom's deepest wound was losing his mother. He said that when things became difficult for Tom, he ran away, buried into that loneliness that he had accepted from an early age. At 16 years old, Tom told the director of a BBC documentary that he had a calling to climb. And this wasn't just any documentary. The BBC crew had been following the Ballard family for decades. Ever since Tom and Kate's childhood journey to K2, they'd been documenting the family's life in the aftermath of Alison's death, capturing how the children have grown up in the shadow of her legacy. Tom had spent most of his life in front of the cameras. And now, at 16, when they asked him what climbing meant to him, his answer was simple. He agreed that he had a calling to climb, saying that it just felt right. Alison had started out climbing solo out of necessity. As a mother with young kids, she couldn't always find climbing partners. But when she started, she became addicted to it. When asked why she liked climbing, she gave the same answer for the most part, saying, "Because I like standing on the top." Jim believed it was something more than that, though. He said it was as much spiritual as it was physical. And for Tom, it was no different. He said soloing is the tip of the spear that is climbing. There's nothing, no one between you and the mountain. You become in tune as one, as part of the mountain, a moving piece of ice or rock. But he also knew what it meant, saying the risks are obvious. One slip, one mistake, one stone hit, one broken piece of ice or rock, then it's good night. But it didn't stop him. He said, while soloing, I've developed a style of climbing where I have full awareness and a feel of the mountain. I am almost in control. When I breathe in, the mountain breathes out. The mountains had pulled him in completely now, and there was no turning back. 14 years after Alison's death, Tom returned to the Eiger's north face, the mountain he climbed before he was even born. Now 21 years old, in the winter of 2009, he stood at the base of the Eiger for the first time since his mother had climbed it while pregnant with him. Despite nasty weather limiting his progress, Tom successfully climbed the entire route. It was the first of many solo ascents in the Alps. And by 2015, Tom and Jim had fully committed to the nomadic climbing lifestyle. They lived out of a Volkswagen van and climbed across the Alps. By this time, Kate had gone her own way, working as a snowboard instructor, but Tom and Jim lived simply, completely focused on climbing. Their life was stripped down to the bare essentials. They shared a tent for meals, had separate tents for sleeping. They spent their days brewing tea, playing cards, mending gear, reading, and of course, climbing. And Tom climbed like a man possessed. A friend once asked him how many routes he'd climbed in his first season in the Alps, and he told the person 66 routes. His friend was shocked and said, "You know, Tom, a summer of climbing for you is a lifetime of climbing for everyone else." Jim's pension was just enough for them to live on. They didn't need much, just food, gas, and gear. Even then, Tom's climbing gear was outdated and patched together. He used homemade hardware that Jim made from scrap metal, and for a long time, he used his mother's old ice tools. Despite their close living arrangement, though, there remained an emotional distance between the two of them. It wasn't cold exactly, but it was reserved. and they functioned more like climbing partners than family. And yet, when Tom decided to push himself beyond anything he had done before, Jim was there to help. He was chauffeur, belayer, base camp attendant, whatever Tom needed, he was there. And that next challenge of Tom's? It was the 6 Great North Faces of the Alps. You may be asking yourself, what are the 6 Great North Faces of the Alps? Well, let me tell you. Tom had never sought attention for his climbs, and he didn't chase sponsors. He rarely talked about his achievements. He just climbed. But one day in 2015, he decided it was time to push himself to a new level. His mother had completed all 6 Great North Faces of the Alps in a single summer season. Tom would do the same, but in winter. And it had never been done before. Jim thought it was impossible, but if his son wanted to try it, Jim would support him however he could. Even then, Tom was kind of flying under the radar. He wasn't chasing fame, he wasn't looking for headlines. He soloed some of the hardest routes in the Dolomites, but instead of tackling famous walls, he often chose these lesser-known ones, routes that wouldn't really make the news. Still, he landed his first sponsor, a sock company. His inspiration to take on this new challenge, well, it was the French climber Gaston Rebouffet, the first to climb all 6 faces. And of course, Tom's mother was another inspiration. He said she was and still is the greatest female mountaineer to ever strap on a pair of crampons. Tom believed this challenge had been set in motion even before he was born. He said subconsciously that her climbing the Eiger while pregnant with him is where the scheme must have been born. Some of her energy and passion for this project must have transferred onto me. Then on December 21st, 2014, he started the first of the 6 faces, and it almost ended the next day. The first climb was Cima Grande de la Veradero. I hope I didn't butcher that. It was a tough one. This has taken me like 7 times to say it. Anyways, this is the sheerest of the 6 faces and the most technical. And it was a brutal way to start. It's a towering 3,000 meters or almost 10,000 feet. It's a limestone wall that looks like something almost out of a fantasy novel. It's covered in overhangs and it's brutal, even in summer. But in winter, just surviving up there is an achievement. But Tom wasn't totally unfamiliar with it. He'd climbed it before in the summer of 2011, but this was different. He was alone and it was winter. He started later in the day than expected and found himself still climbing as the sun disappeared. He reached the summit in the dark, tired and very cold, and then he realized that he had forgotten his headlamp. Descending in total darkness was too dangerous because he couldn't even find the trail, so he had no choice but to sleep out beneath a small overhang. The temperature plummeted that night and he curled up laying on his rope trying to stay warm. By morning, his toes were numb. And as soon as the sun rose, he descended as fast as he could. Jim took one look at his feet and got him to the hospital right away. Tom had frostbite, but luckily would keep all of his toes. It was only the first climb of the 6 and it had nearly taken him out. But stopping was never an option. Next up was Piz Badil, an almost 3,000-foot vertical wall that would be the longest climb of the 6. Back in 1937, a team of climbers got caught up in a storm on it, and only half of them made it back down. Tom started in total darkness, moving slowly through the deep snow towards the base, and the going was painfully slow. For 11 straight hours he climbed, higher and higher past ice-covered slabs and exposed ridges until he finally reached the summit. Then he slept out alone in the freezing cold before making his way back down. Another night in the open and another battle with the cold, but it was another successful climb. The Matterhorn was third on Tom's list, probably the most famous peak in the Alps, and the North Face is entirely another beast. It stands at 4,478 meters or 14,690 feet. With avalanches, collapsing ice, rock falls, this face has taken down some of the best climbers in history. But for Tom, it was the easiest of the 6. Most climbers can do this in about 6 hours. Tom reached the summit in just 3. He was on a roll, and he was halfway there. The Grand Jurasse was next, a massive ice and rock face that towers 1,200 meters or almost 4,000 feet above a glacier. Climbers call it one of the wildest places in the mountain range. And climbing the North Face means a complicated and dangerous descent on the south side. Tom took a new route up it for him, and he clocked in at 3 hours and 20 minutes. Number 5 on his list was Petite Dru. It's not as big as the Matterhorn, but it stands at about 3,700 meters or 12,000 feet, and it's way more dangerous. The whole thing is constantly falling apart. There's huge rock falls that have wiped out entire sections of the face. And just to get to the bottom of this route, it involves hours of skiing uphill with a loaded pack. Sounds like fun, eh? On March 14th, Tom climbed it in 8 hours. Another brutal ascent, but another summit. With just 1 week left in the winter, Tom was running out of time, and he had just one mountain left, the Eiger. It's the most infamous of them all, also known as Murder Wall. Over 70 climbers have died on this face, and even today, it's one of the most feared routes in the Alps. Tom knew it well, but climbing it solo in winter was a whole different level. Here's what Tom wrote about that day. Thursday morning dawns clear. I am very reluctant to leave the warmth of my sleeping bag. With heavy footsteps, I trudge around to the foot of the face. The Eiger is well known to me. I have climbed here in every season of the year, put up new routes, made many first winter ascents. Alas, here I am at 7:39 in the morning beginning the climb. The face is towering menacingly above me. I follow the recent footmarks, weaving, traversing, always looking for the easiest path. Perhaps a lost art, finding the path the least resistance, of weakness, something the pioneers of old were masters at. Nowadays, we look for the direct or extreme. I think we have lost something. After 5 hours and 38 minutes, Tom stood on the summit of the Eiger. Not just the Eiger, though, not just one more climb. He had just completed the 6 great north faces of the Alps in winter. He had done what no one else had ever done before. But oddly enough, he didn't immediately feel relief from doing this. He said he finally achieved this project, a lifetime dream, but instead of feeling a sense of achievement, he said, I feel a slight emptiness. He said, the success will dawn on me in a few days when I have rested. And hopefully when I feel human again. A smile will slowly spread across my face of a dream fulfilled. As Tom made his way down, he saw something ahead. A body lying motionless on the ice. It was a skier, and then it dawned on him. Tom had spoken to that skier that very morning. They crossed paths on the summit and shared a brief moment. Just 2 people at the top of the mountain enjoying the moment. Now just hours later, that same man was gone. He had fallen on the descent, hit his head on the rocks, and died instantly. Tom had never seen a body before, and he paused, just staring at the figure. The life ended in an instant on the same slopes he had just ascended. That was a reminder of what the mountains could do. It was an unsettling moment, but even more so when he realized that 20 years earlier, his mother had descended the same mountain and also found a body. The same eerie discovery, the same brutal reminder. Tom later described it as a strange kind of déjà vu. What were the odds? 2 climbers, mother and son, decades apart on the same mountain. They both walked away from the Eiger, but not everyone was so lucky. And as he predicted earlier, Tom said the weight of his accomplishment finally hit him. He said, a huge weight, like a big lump of concrete, was lifted off my shoulders. I suddenly felt so much better. After completing the greatest challenge of his career, Tom then made a change. He moved out of the van and campground and got his own place a short drive from his girlfriend. For the first time, he wanted more independence, to separate himself from his father a bit and to do his own thing. But at his core, nothing changed. He climbed constantly. He and his girlfriend tackled new routes together. But even as Tom kept a low profile, people had started to notice him. The Guardian called him the King of the Alps. But it didn't seem to matter to Tom. In 2015, he started competing in the Ice Climbing World Cup, but he never placed higher than 14th. A close friend later said that alone was proof of Tom's lack of ego. He didn't climb for competition. He climbed because it was who he was. Tom had strong opinions about what climbing should be. He had no respect for the Everest industry, tourists with money, oxygen, and Sherpas to carry their gear. He believed in serving an apprenticeship the same way his mother did, earning their way up the mountain. With mountaineering, he said, it's not just about the summit, it's about how you go about it, and that's a huge part of it. He also hated the word conquer when people referred to climbing. He said, you can't conquer anything in life, least of all a mountain. Just when you think conditions are difficult, nature is quite capable of dishing up something far bigger and far worse than you anticipated. But that word conquer has deep roots in mountaineering. Julie Rack is a professor of English and film studies who wrote a book called False Summit. And sidebar, this is a fantastic book that looks at the role of gender politics in narratives about high-altitude mountaineering. And in her book, she talks about early climbing culture, and she shows how early British climbers borrowed military language to describe their ascents. Tom wanted nothing to do with that mindset. For him, mountains weren't something to be defeated, they were something to be understood. respected to survive on. In 2017, Tom and Kate returned to Pakistan together, for the first time since they had traveled there as children to see K2. This time, though, it wasn't about closure, it was an expedition. Kate planned to trek and snowboard, and Tom would climb with Italian alpinist Daniele Nardi and his team. Tom and Daniele, they had a close call with falling seracs, massive towers of ice that collapsed without warning. Tom said the serac missed them by a whisker. The Italians opened a new route during this expedition and named it Alison's Peak. Tom had nothing to do with the name, and even here, 25 years after her death, he couldn't escape Alison's legacy. But Tom and Daniele, they got along really well. Daniele had already climbed 5 8,000-meter peaks and had attempted Nanga Parbat in winter 4 times. Tom respected him, and he learned from him. And then a year later, Daniele called him again. He was going back to Nanga Parbat, and he wanted Tom to join him on the Mummery Spur in winter. This was the most dangerous route on the mountain, but Tom was intrigued. There was something really interesting about this whole thing, kind of haunting, you could say. Nanga Parbat wasn't just one of the world's deadliest mountains. It sat less than 200 kilometers or 120 miles from K2. The same Karakoram range with the same unpredictable storms as the place that had taken his mother. Jim later said he was surprised Tom chose Nanga Parbat instead of K2. He said, "I think Tom resisted K2 much longer than he should have because he felt that everyone would think he was only going there because his mother died there." But Tom still had a plan to climb K2, and Nanga Parbat was a step in that direction. And all mountain climbers get this question, and we're always asking them to answer it. Why climb? Tom tried to address it a few times and said he wasn't in it for the thrill. To him, mountaineering wasn't him chasing an adrenaline high. He said it's a quiet thing, especially at the summit when you feel you've achieved something. Climbing is a combination of things: beauty, danger, and a sense of achievement. And a reporter asked him once, "When you lose your mother so young, what draws you to the pursuit that killed her? Can children inherit an affinity for peril?" Tom's answer was pretty simple. He said, "No, I grew up with the mountains. I feel totally at ease in the mountains. It's down here where I feel uncomfortable." And people always asked him, "What do you think about when you're climbing a mountain? Your mother?" And he replied, "No, oddly enough, I'm thinking mainly about not falling off." And that was Tom, dry, matter-of-fact, and quietly funny. Tom never tried to deny his mother influence. He just didn't want it to define him. He said, "I always thought that one day people would stop comparing me to her. That with time, my name would stand on its own." His girlfriend believed that a part of him climbed because of Alison, even if he denied it. And the truth seems to be that Tom wasn't always really sure why he climbed either. He said, "When I was younger, I used to climb the mountains for her, but then I realized that's silly. She had already climbed them all herself. She's only one of the reasons I do it." One of his climbing partners once told him, "You must be Tom Ballard, not the son of Alison Hargreaves. After you become the great Tom Ballard the mountaineer, then you can talk about her more freely." And even now, standing at the base of Nanga Parbat, he wasn't just Tom Ballard. He was Alison's son. And whether he meant to or not, Tom was following his mother's path, right to the mountains that had taken her. 30 years old, Tom joined Daniele to attempt a winter ascent of Nanga Parbat, a peak that had only seen its first winter ascent in 2016. They arrived in Pakistan at the end of December 2018. They spent weeks battling extreme conditions in hopes of making only the 3rd ever winter ascent of the peak. But this wasn't just any route on the mountain. They were attempting the Mummery Spur, a legendary and unfinished route. For Tom, Nanga was a huge leap, maybe too big, some said. Unlike Daniele, who had already tried the Mummery Spur several times, Tom had never been above 6,000 meters. And in winter, it was a different world. 8,000-meter peaks in winter are notorious for 100-mile-per-hour winds, bone-chilling temperatures, and avalanches that will wipe out an entire camp in seconds. Most of the 14 8,000-meter peaks had only ever been climbed in winter once. This was not where most climbers started their high-altitude careers. The Mummery Spur itself was notorious. It's a spiky, exposed ridge that jutted up the west face of Nanga Parbat. It runs from the base of the mountain all the way to a plateau below the summit pyramid. Only a handful of climbers had ever set foot on this route. In 1970, Reinhold Messner and his brother Gunther descended via the Mummery Spur, and Gunther started suffering from altitude sickness. He was later killed by an avalanche. Reinhold later said that it's the most dangerous route on Nanga Parbat. We were forced to go down there. We went down wherever it was possible, but we were just hoping that we would have a chance to survive. I would never try to climb it from the bottom to the top. In 2016, Simon Morrow, who made the first winter ascent of Nanga Parbat, was even more blunt, saying, climbing the Mummery Spur is suicidal. And for Tom, a first-time 8,000-meter climber in winter on an unfinished route, Simon said that's not the obvious way to start a high-altitude career. It was a very hardcore beginning. Tom and Daniele made little progress due to the harsh weather and the deep snow. By mid-January, 2 Pakistani climbers on their team left because of the difficult conditions and poor weather forecast. One of them left because he said he didn't want to die. He thought it was that dangerous. In a blog post, Tom described how even the simplest tasks became impossible. At night, he could barely turn the pages of a book before his fingers went numb. And when the blizzards came, they were trapped at base camp for days, passing the time bouldering just to stay fit. On the good days, they pushed higher. Camp 1, Camp 2, then Camp 3 at 5,700 meters. Camp 3 was sheltered in a crevasse, but Tom still described the winds as bloomin' awful when they were up there. They made multiple pushes towards Camp 4, but each time the weather forced them back. Tom wrote that the threat of avalanches made us turn back without spending the night. Each time they returned to the camps, they found their tents buried by fresh slides. One day, they nearly ignored their instincts. Tom said, we turned back from Camp 1 because we didn't have a good feeling. Shortly after, a huge avalanche engulfed the route. That gut feeling saved them. On February 19th, Tom wrote, base camp life is becoming almost like a holiday while we wait for that elusive weather window. Many new and interesting boulder problems, lunch in the sun, and afternoon skiing. What more could you want? On the afternoon of February 24th, Daniele made a call to his sponsor. The GPS data from that call placed them at 6,300 meters. They were descending to 6,000 meters where they had set up a portaledge at Camp 4 to take shelter from an incoming storm. That evening at 6:30 p.m., Daniele called his wife, and then a last call to base camp. He said, we're going to try to descend further to Camp 3 at 5,700 meters. After that, they went silent. At first, team members at base camp assumed that Tom and Daniele were in a radio dead zone and unable to check in. But as the days dragged on, that seemed less and less likely. From base camp, their 2 cooks and a Pakistani military officer scanned the slopes with binoculars, searching for any sign of movement. But low clouds and snow made it difficult to see. Days passed and there was still no sign of the men. Then finally a break in the weather. For the first time since February 24th, the view from base camp was clear. And still there was no sign of the 2 men. By now, an international rescue effort was underway. On March 3rd, climber Alex Chicon and his team, who had been attempting a winter ascent of K2, flew over to Nanga Parbat by helicopter to join the search. The conditions were unstable and volatile. Small avalanches rumbled down the slopes as they scanned the climber's route. They could feel the mountains shifting around them. Then on March 5th, Alex spotted something with his drone. As it hovered over their last known position, there in the frozen landscape were 2 motionless figures. He recognized their gear and knew it was Tom and Daniele. 5,800 meters within rock and snow, their bodies were found. They were roped together not 10 feet apart. The upper figure was still holding onto a fixed line leading up and out of sight. The lower figure was contorted and suspended below. The news got back to their families. Kate, who was working in South Africa, was the first to hear, and she was inconsolable. She had been here before. She lost her mother and her brother, both to the same world that shaped them. Jim was broken, and in a strange twist of fate, their family's decades-long documentary was still being filmed. The director, Chris Terrell, who had originally filmed the family at K2 in 1995, was actually with Jim when the call came in. He later said it was a brutal moment. I didn't know whether to keep filming or go hug Jim, so I hid behind the camera and kept filming. Jim just shook his head as he processed the news. He said, to have this happen a second time, it's almost more than I can handle. It's not right that a parent should outlive their offspring. So what went wrong? Had they lost their way in a storm, run out of supplies, or had something worse happened? Tom had always been calculated and methodical, and he didn't take unnecessary risks. Chris Terrell, who had known him for decades, said Tom didn't have a reckless bone in his body. Reinhold Messner, who met Tom and was a big fan of his, said that maybe he was too good for everything at home and was looking for something great to do in the Himalayas. Some believed Daniele had convinced Tom to attempt the Mummery Spur, but others disagreed. One climber who knew him very well said, "I don't think Tom was easily convinced. At the end of the day, he wanted to try that route too." 2 days before he died, his girlfriend messaged him one last time. She didn't have a good feeling about the trip and told him that she wasn't happy he was climbing there, that it was dangerous. She begged him to come home, but his reply was final. He said, "If you don't like it, leave me." And that was the last thing he ever said to her. The real cause of their deaths wasn't clear early on. At first, some believe a serac had collapsed on top of them, but when rescuers examined the scene, a different picture emerged. Tom's sister was told that Tom may have become tangled in the ropes, and Daniele had climbed back up to cut the rope to free him. But they were already in an impossible situation. Rescuers believed that the weather sealed their fate. One of the searchers said they were probably really cold and exhausted. It was high winds, it was late. If you haven't got the possibility for warmth, any small mistake, you're dead. Their bodies remain there to this day. They're at an elevation where it's just too dangerous to recover them. And Daniele's family requested that his body not be retrieved anyways. Tom had said years earlier that when asked about his mother's resting place, he said that they would rather that she's not found, and that it was where she was evidently most comfortable, so we would prefer that she stays there. You gotta really feel for Kate. She had spent her whole life living with loss. First her mother, now her brother, who she was super close with. She had always tried to justify the risks they took, but now she had to face this impossible question. Had they sentenced her to a life of enduring grief? She needed answers, so she traveled to Nanga Parbat 6 months after Tom's death. In the documentary The Last Mountain, she retraces Tom's final steps. The moment is emotionally crushing. It's just brutal to watch. And yet in the film, she reunites with Ibrahim, the porter who had carried her on his back when she was a kid. That moment where they met again for the first time after 25 years was the most moving part of the film, the director said. And it is. It's a sob fest if you watch it. The Last Mountain, the documentary, wasn't just about Tom, although it focused on him a lot. It was about Kate and about how you keep going when the mountains take everything from you. Graham Zimmerman, an American climber and friend of theirs, believed Tom's death would change how he was remembered. He said there's a lot of climbers who will have no clue who this guy was. But looking at Tom's career, I think he'll kind of be a climber who will be appreciated more after his time. But Tom wasn't climbing for a legacy. One of his answers to why he climbed was intriguing. He said maybe it's cowardice, this urge to hide away in the mountains. And then you start to ask, where does courage stop and stupidity begin? But whether he meant to or not, he followed his mother's path, right to the mountains that had taken her.